Hello there. Today's video, Malicious Compliance. My BF wanted me to do an IQ test to prove how intellectually superior he was. When I was 17 at the time, I had a boyfriend who was very pretentious. I personally always found that funny, so I didn't mind. However, he was hell-bent on proving how much more intelligent he was than me. One day, he was bragging about an online IQ test he did and how smart he was. He begged me to do one as well. However, I had just smoked and was high, so I refused. After some more begging, I decided why not. It could be fun. Despite being high, I scored higher on the IQ test. He was so pissed it was hilarious. He never bragged about his IQ test again. Another time, he really wanted to show off by playing chess against me. I'm really bad at the game and told him so. But I knew people who were good, and they gave me the advice to never have a pawn that was not protected by another. So I did just that. Halfway through, I had captured most of his pawn, and he rage quit. At chess, he flipped the board and broke some of his pieces. Needless to say, a week or two after we were no longer together, I made him too insecure, and he went back to his ex, who he called extremely stupid. At least he gave me a lot of laughing materials for years to come. Tell your boss you're quitting. This isn't my story, but my mother's. She died recently at the age of 89, and my sister and I were reminiscing. This is one of our favorite stories involving our mother. My brothers called her V because her first name begins with V, so I'll refer to her as V. This happened many years ago, about the time I graduated from high school. V had taken a job, her first since she and my dad got married, in a public kindergarten. Now, my dad was always a bit of a bully, especially towards my mother. My dad was not a nice person, and that's a whole story in itself. V had survived ovarian cancer at the age of 33, so she was probably about 38-39 when this happened. Now, my dad insisted that if she was going to hold down a job, she still had to do all her chores when she got home: cooking, cleaning, laundry, etc. I can't remember exactly what prompted the argument about her chores, but something didn't get done that he expected and demanded that she do. He informed her that she would tell her boss that she was quitting when she went back to work the next day. Before he left for work the next day, he reminded her that she was to tell her boss that she was quitting. Cue malicious compliance. I loved my mom. She went to work that morning, stopped at her boss's office, and said these exact words: "My husband said to tell you that I was quitting," and then moseyed on to her classroom. A few minutes later, her very puzzled boss popped in and asked her if she was serious. She said no, but my husband told me to tell you I was quitting, so I did. And no, she didn't quit her job until she was good and ready, several years later. We're going to have to throw them away. In the late 90s, I volunteered at a small private school. They had little money for extras like computers or computer teachers. I don't know much about computers, but I knew how to plug them in, and I know how to put one together if you gave me all the parts. So naturally, I got asked to be the director of the computer lab. It had 2 very old computers. And naturally, it was a volunteer job. I had very little money and a lot of time. They knew that I wanted a job. They told me that after I build it up, they would put a salary in the budget. I taught classes the difference between the components, some file structure, some basic, some DOS, and how rebooting your computer usually solves whatever problems you have. The concept of drivers. The thing is, the director of the school hated fundraising. So my salary never got added to the budget. And the director often kept himself busy doing other things. Useless things. One sunny morning, he finds me and tells me to wish him luck. If today goes right, we're going to have a huge computer lab. He comes back from his meeting with a huge smile. I did it. I convinced a bank to donate to us their old computers. Okay. Great. Now I have to set up and maintain 50 new, for us, computers. I can't wait. The computers got delivered the next week. All terminals. These were bank computers. I had no idea how to get them running. They didn't have hard drives or operating systems. The keyboard and mouse ports were different. They were not the standard PS2 at the time. I think they somehow connected to a server, which did not get donated. Their monitors only did text. No graphics. They were useless to us. We needed something to run America online. Encarta. Maybe SimCity. You know, educational stuff. I had no idea how to get these to work. I tried asking the director, telling him that the 50 computers were useful. He got super annoyed. I'm sure they can be helpful in some way. They must be worth something. Figure it out, because if you can't, we're going to have to throw them away. He thought he was threatening me. He did not think I'd throw out 50 computers. After all, he worked hard to get them. I did not hesitate at all. My next class, I had screwdrivers for everyone. We disassembled everything. If it had a screw, we unscrewed it. The class figured out what each piece was. And then the class activity was to take the pieces to the dumpster. By the end of the day, there was nothing left. The next day the director asked me where the computers were. Oh, you were right. They were very useful. The students took them apart, learned all about the different components, and then threw them out. Just like you said we should. His face turned all sorts of colors. And he stormed out. What I didn't tell him is that I saved the RAM from the garbage. I mean, after all, it was in the garbage. Right? And sold them on the online classifieds, remember Yahoo classifieds, for $20 a piece. There were 2 in each computer. So I got $2,000. I guess they were useful after all. Sure, the longest a customer will ever have to wait is 15 seconds. So I worked in a fairly large store that wasn't very busy until 3 p.m. and only had 2 to 3 employees in the floor in the morning. We were getting complaints from customers that they'd have to wait a minute or 2 at the register before getting checked out. We were always filling stock in the aisles and weren't allowed to just stay at the register. Management decided that the longest any customer should have to wait was 15 seconds before starting checkout. As I always do, when given tasks that contradict each other, I ask, hey, what gets priority, getting our stock out or ensuring this checkout happens within 15 seconds? They confirmed that it was the customer service and that it was a top priority. Perfect. I had my cart of stock and I was in charge of the register. My cart was about 7 seconds of walking time away from where I could view the register. So I literally walked for 7 seconds, checked, walked back for 7 seconds, which left me with a single second to do stock. Normally you can get a cart of stock out in about 30 minutes, my cart was still quite full after about 4 hours. Management came by and saw me walking back and forth barely doing any work. I reminded her that what I was doing was top priority, and since I wasn't allowed to stay at the register, that I was accomplishing both my tasks in the most efficient way possible. The next day the 15-second rule had been abolished. Being an engineer is freaking based when your management is incompetent. I'm a factory automation engineer with companies like Tesla on my resume. At my current factory job, shortly after I joined the company, I solved a problem that one of our processes had been having for literally the entire 20 years this factory has been standing, because my specific educational focus in engineering school was centered around exactly the kind of problem this process was having. I had the permission from my direct supervisor and production management to implement the fix for this specific factory line. The other lines were running well enough without it that I didn't feel it was necessary to apply it across the factory. It was just this one line that ran like shit for whatever reason. So I fixed the problem I saw. I did this for about 6 months and managed to fix problems with literally dozens of different processes across the factory. All the while, I had no idea that there was a rule determined by our corporate engineering manager that all factory processes had to run on the same set of control parameters and that we were forbidden from changing the parameters that I had been running around changing. I didn't know this was a rule, and I never thought to consider that it might be a rule because it's an absolutely stupid rule, because process controls are supposed to be tuned individually to the equipment they are controlling. Every piece of industrial hardware is slightly different, even when the equipment is ostensibly identical. Without getting too technical, things like electric motors have subtle variations in the windings that make them respond differently to current flowing through them. Heating units have slightly different thermal mass and other properties that makes them heat up a little faster or slower. The automated controls for those processes have to use slightly different control parameters to account for these subtle differences in equipment. But apparently, This manager read about corporate standardization in a book somewhere and decided that every line across all of our factories needed to run the same controller constants. He had spent years in his own factory forcing his technicians to find a single set of parameters that worked across all his lines. Apparently he managed to find a set of parameters that didn't cause the equipment to catch fire, so in his infinite wisdom, he had spent the last 5 or 6 years shoving that mandate up the ass of all his technicians and subordinate engineers so that he could report to his bosses that he had been putting the hammer down standardizing our processes. So in his eyes, I was fucking up the whole factory by tuning those controller constants to match the hardware they were running on. After trying to explain that's not how any of this works and getting about as far as that old lady in the commercial, I acquiesced to the manager's very explicit and stern demands to put everything back exactly the way it was supposed to be. I barely managed to avoid being fired on the spot by apologizing profusely for my mistake because I didn't realize that there was a standard in place. So when scrap and quality rejects at our factory doubled in a single week and we lost about 70 hours of uptime because of jammed up processes at a cost of about $10,000 per hour in lost productivity, there was suddenly a big meeting demanded by corporate to come yell at us for costing the company about $2 million in 1 week between all the increased scrap and downtime. At that meeting, I explained exactly the changes that I had been making to the processes over the course of the previous 6 months. I had charts from our historian for every single process before I made my original changes, after I made the changes, and after I was compelled under threat of losing my job to revert all the changes I made back to the original parameters. I got the opportunity to explain to that engineering manager's boss that homogenizing code and standardizing processes is a good idea on the whole, but that there are specific equipment parameters that need to be tuned individually for each process they are running on, and that these parameters often need to be retuned if something about the process changes in a way that affects the performance of that process, such as changes in materials or natural wear and tear on components. And I explained that while one factory was able to find a set of parameters that worked across all their lines without causing catastrophic failures, most of those lines were actually performing quite sluggishly, and I demonstrated using our own plant's data how similarly performing lines at our factory before my changes dramatically improved yield and uptime when the processes were tuned individually. The corporate engineering manager got fired, and I got 40% of my annual salary as a bonus this year, along with everyone at my plant getting maxed out bonuses because of how well the plant performed this year. Edit. Wow, everybody. Thanks for participating in this thread. This is my first post going over 5K likes. It's going to take a week to go through my inbox. Talking to all the engineers here has been great. But I think what's even more rewarding is the number of managers I have seen in this thread who are seeing this discussion being had for the first time. Factories have shut down over this issue when lean adherents don't understand the difference between standardizing things like process setpoints across hardware, which is vital, and trying to standardize things like controller constants that need to be tuned individually to the hardware they are controlling. This mistake cost my factory literally $2 million a week in lost productivity, so it's extremely gratifying to see that this is actually helping members of management see where the boundaries of standardization are in practice. Good luck to all my factory operators, technicians, engineers and managers out there. It's an amazing thing to participate in the act of using automation to beat back the existential economic scarcity that has threatened the survival of the species since day one. What an amazing time to be alive. That's all, folks. If you like this content, please subscribe, hit the like button, and check out my next video. Take care.